what the United States needs to do is to blunt Russia's ability to take more territory on the ground and to help Ukraine defend itself against this bombardment. Because if Putin thinks he can't go any further, then that might be, a reason for him to actually have some kind of serious negotiation.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we are welcoming for the first time Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, Dr. Fiona Hill. Fiona was the White House's Chief Russia Intelligence Advisor during Donald Trump's first term. She served as an intelligence analyst for George Bush and Barack Obama and was appointed a defense advisor to the British government in 2024. She's written several books, including Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, and most recently, There Is Nothing for You Here. Fiona Hill, welcome to Frontline.
Thanks so much, Kate. Great to be with you.
Well, can we just start then with this world first, the public meeting of President Putin and President Xi and Kim Jong-un in China? How was Vladimir using this opportunity, do you think, and the summit before it, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to enhance his power and justify his war in Ukraine?
Well, I think it was very significant in terms of the optics, obviously. I mean, it's not just symbolic, but it's really a loud message to the United States and to the rest of the world that Putin and Russia are in no means isolated, and that, in fact, what many saw as a kind of axis of convenience between and among China and North Korea may be something else, and maybe, in fact, developing into something much more strategic and perhaps even enduring, because most observers, obviously see a lot of differences between China and North Korea and Russia on world affairs. And Russia and China both used to keep Kim Jong-un and North Korea to pretty much at an arm's length distance in terms of foreign policy. A lot of concerns that they had previously about the rogue behavior of North Korea on the world stage. But it's now making it very clear that, in fact, their adversary is really the United States. And all three of them see the United States as a bigger problem on the world stage. And in fact, they're signaling to the rest of the world that they should too. And it's, as you said, it's not just the optics of the meeting in Beijing, which is against the backdrop of victory over Japan, victory in Asia 80 years ago in World War II, in which China and Russia, then the Soviet Union, were definitely on the victorious side. North Korea, obviously in a pretty different place at that particular point, as that Korea was also occupied by Japan. But again, giving that kind of symbol here that these are the three powers, Asian powers, because Russia is also an Asian power, that participated in that defeat of Japan in World War II. But before that, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you saw a three-way meeting with Prime Minister Modi of India. So this is also very significant because the United States has been trying to woo India and create an alliance with India since the first term of Donald Trump. And we're now seeing that that appears to have failed completely, because India is now apparently, so it seemed again from the optics, siding with Russia and even China, which India has a very difficult relationship with because of all these tensions and stresses with the United States.
Yeah, just to pick up on what you were saying about Narendra Modi, I mean, the fact that he held hands, or he took the hand of President Putin visibly up for the cameras when they met at that summit, it is a clear rebuke, isn't it, to Trump and his recent botched handling of relations with India. It's been described to me by someone else today as being totally inept.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the symbolism of the hand, you were using that in various different ways, probably unconsciously. But in a way, Modi taking the hand of Russia is a bite on the hand of the United States, because, the United States has been anything but a reliable partner for India. Now, we can take issue with all the kinds of things that India, may be doing in terms of increased purchases of Russian oil. Certainly, there's a lot of evidence that the Indians are even helping the Russians out militarily. And of course, India and the Soviet Union had a long-standing friendship and partnership all the way during the Cold War. And India has been quite reliant on Russia for arms sales all the way through since the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the Indians have put what many have thought is a very misplaced confidence in their relationship with Russia, because it's not like the Russians are really going to help the Indians out in any confrontation with China. But basically, what Modi was also signaling there at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting was he was patching things up with China, and he was relying on India's own diplomacy and own efforts to engage with China, and wasn't going to look to the United States in that way. So, yes, absolutely a mishandling of relationships with India by the Trump administration.
And how significant do you think it is that President Xi not only invited the North Korean leader Kim Jong un, but also allowed him to meet Putin on Chinese soil when the North Korean leader vowed to do everything he could to help Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, that is actually very serious from the perspective of Ukraine, and also from the perspective of Europe and the United Kingdom, it has to be said. And I do think that there should be a separate set of remonstrations and engagement by the UK and by the Europeans with China over this, because you have North Korea fighting not only in Russia and Russian territory against Ukraine, but essentially introducing themselves into a European conflict. This is, after all, the largest war in Europe since World War II, and it is against a European country. Irrespective of whether Ukraine is a member of the European Union or in NATO, Ukraine has all kinds of relationships with European countries, including the United Kingdom, and this is an affront also to Europe. Now, whether China and North Korea see it as such is another matter, but Putin knows it is. And Putin is actually making the point that Europe and the United Kingdom are irrelevant in world affairs, and this is all about the United States. And look, I think the sad fact is that China, North Korea, and Russia all see the European countries, continental Europe, UK, and all the rest, as vassal states of the United States. They don't see them as independent actors. And I think that's something that has to change from here on out, because this is a very uncomfortable position for Europeans to be in. This is a slap in the face of the United Kingdom and of European countries as well, not just of the United States.
I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that a little later on. Just want to ask you a little bit, though, about Donald Trump's reaction to the events in China, firing off this post on social media accusing Russia, China, and North Korea of conspiring against the US. How much of a humiliation is it in the week that he had expected Putin to meet, or at least set a date to meet with President Zelensky?
Well, he's right in this case. I mean, he's actually wised up, to the fact that the three of them are aligning against the United States. We've been seeing this for some time. I mean, ever since North Korean troops were introduced into the battlefield in Ukraine, ever since China, North Korea, and also Iran started to give direct material or direct diplomatic and other support to Russia, certainly in terms of helping Russia evade sanctions. I mean, it's become very clear that they have seen Ukraine as a proxy war against the United States. And Trump has recognized that, to give him, some due here. But what he's tried to do is separate off all of the countries and try to reset the bilateral relationship with Russia. That was what that spectacle was in Alaska as much as anything else. It seemed to be less about getting a ceasefire or an armistice in Ukraine. In fact, Trump moved away from that after Alaska, and much more about rolling out the red carpet, literally, and resetting the relationship with Russia, and trying to create this idea of bonhomie and something more between him and Putin, stressing all the time the importance of that bilateral relationship, and then of course also reaching out to North Korea, as he had in his first term, suggesting that he could put on again this show of bilateral relations with North Korea, that showmanship that we saw the first time around, that he was going to rekindle that again. There were all kinds of signs that he was going to start with outreach to North Korea. Of course, he had outreach to Iran. And then, as you're also suggesting, he was hoping that there would be a meeting, in fact, with Putin, but also that he would be on his way to having meetings with President Xi and some progress in the China-US relationship. He was constantly talking about that. So this is really, I think, a realization on his part that all of that has founded. And it's founded because of the unpredictability of his diplomacy and many of the actions that he's taken.
And almost to show his contempt, President Putin, instead of setting a realistic date or venue to meet Zelensky, invited him to Moscow, which he knows is never going to happen, is it? I mean, he just can't risk his life, being a tenth on his life yet again by going to Moscow this time. I mean, it has been a very good few weeks, hasn't it, for President Putin? Red carpet in Alaska, red carpet in China. He clearly feels he's setting the agenda, particularly over the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, and a global agenda as well. I mean, another part of the rebuke is that this is in Asia. This is the commemoration of the end of the war in Asia. And of course, it was the United States that played a major role in this. In fact, the United States only went into World War II because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And it was first and foremost a war with Japan in Asia. And the United States participated and assisted in the liberation of China and of Korea from Japanese occupation in World War II. Now, of course, things have moved on a lot since then. Japan and the United States have an alliance. But we always forget from the European perspective, again, that Russia is an Asian power. Russia's landmass extends to the Asia Pacific, and although it's not heavily populated, Russia has been very significant since the end of World War II as a naval power in particular in that region. And we've also seen that Russia has drawn much closer to China and North Korea in the last couple of years in military terms as well. It seems now that a military relationship of sorts is developing between Russia and North Korea, not just between Russia and Japan. And this should be extraordinarily troubling because the United States likes to think of itself as the only player in the Asia Pacific. It's told the Europeans, we don't need you there. And also Japan and South Korea feel very nervous about their alliance relationships with the United States, given the back and forth and prevarications on US support for Ukraine. And now China is basically saying, look, it's not just us that you're having to encounter here in the Asia Pacific. It's also Russia and it's also North Korea.
And how much do you think it is the US administration's chaotic foreign policy and Donald Trump's belief in the power of personality diplomacy that's accelerated this coming together of autocrats at the expense of democratic countries? I mean, as we saw in China, President Xi, the world is at a crossroads. Do you think this is true?
I think this is true, Kate. I think you've put your finger on it very accurately because Trump believes that all these other strongmen in the world, be it Xi or Putin or Kim Jong-un or anyone else for that matter, will recognize him as one of their own, that his personal diplomacy, his charisma, his sending out of untested and frankly incompetent envoys, but just to representatives of him like Steve Witkoff, will convince everyone that dealing with him that he's really serious here. And what they're saying to him is, well, actually, we do have real relationships. There is a long-standing relationship between North Korea and Russia, for example, that goes back to the very beginning of the Kim dynasty. The progenitor of the Kim family line was had very strong ties. Born in fact in the Soviet Union. There's all of these linkages that go back to that period, and a way China, Russia, and North Korea are all basically signaling to Trump that you are not the United States. These relationships are not very significant, and we have our own histories, we have our own relationships, and you're just trying to kind of insert yourself into this, and we're not having any because our interests are different. So, I mean, it's really a rebuke and a signal that the US is going to have some kind of other diplomatic intervention if it wants to do things differently. And all of them are also signaling that military might, this is very interesting also, is not going to solve anything. And that anything that's going to be resolved in the Asia Pacific is going to be done through a really robust diplomacy, obviously with the power of their own military forces backstopping that. But it's really a signal to the United States that everything that it's done so far is inadequate to the task. And if the United States wants to interact with them, it's going to have to do something different.
So when you say there's going to be a need for some kind of diplomatic intervention, what do you think is needed?
Well, I think that the United States is going to have to be serious about state interests. Personal interventions only work so much because, in the view of Xi, Putin, and Kim Jong-un, they're a lot younger than Trump. They're not a full decade younger in terms of Xi and Putin. Both of them will be 73 this year. Kim Jong-un is obviously a lot younger, and he's got his daughter in tow, talking about, the next iteration. And everybody's, wondering, well, who's going to come after Trump? Trump is not going to be there forever. Even if he tries to, regain the presidency in 2028, he hasn't got the same grip over things as Xi and Putin and Kim Jong Un do. I mean, Kim Jong Un is obviously very highly personalized, but in the case of China and Russia, there's a state there, there's a state apparatus that backs up all of these relationships. There are all kinds of other levels of interaction below Xi and Putin that take place. It used to be much more personalized in the past for Russia and China, but they've built up capacities, they've built up linkages, and under Trump, the United States has eroded all of this. So the United States is increasingly seen as less of a leader and less of a player on the global stage. That's the message from their perspective.
If we could just focus in on the situation with Ukraine and the talks that are not really happening about it in terms of getting anywhere close to a ceasefire. Putin at the Alaska summit said he had understandings were reached with Donald Trump about ending the war. Do you think that is true? And if not, what does it tell us about the real nature of the relationship between the two leaders?
Well, I think understandings were conveyed on what Russia would like to see as a means of ending this war. And Putin's made this very clear to everybody. I don't really need to reiterate, the fact of his demands for territorial concessions from Ukraine, for Ukraine to be demilitarized, for Ukraine to agree to neutrality. In fact, for Ukraine just basically to be diminished as any kind of regional actor. So those are the understandings that were conveyed, and Trump can't deliver on that. Trump cannot deliver Ukraine to Vladimir Putin on a platter, and that's basically what Putin is saying. When you can basically give us Ukraine, or when Ukraine is willing to surrender and to capitulate, and when you've got the Europeans reined in, then you basically kind of come back to us. And Putin's made it very clear he has no intention of meeting with Zelensky one-on-one. It was also very clear that he wasn't very keen and was highly unlikely to agree to a trilateral meeting. And he certainly doesn't want to see Europe and European players anywhere near his negotiation table. He wants to negotiate the surrender of Ukraine.
So what do you think President Putin is actually betting on at the moment? Do you think he's playing for time, clearly. Do you think his idea is in that time to try and build this picture of the Europeans and Ukraine being the ones to blame for the war not ending? In the meantime, he gains as much ground as possible and waits for Donald Trump to lose patience and try and force a peace on Ukraine, which actually ultimately is giving more land to Russia and a kind of surrender.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, Kate. Spot on. And what we're seeing right now is again the Russian intensification of bombardment against civilian targets deliberately, to try to reduce morale. Although we know that often doesn't work. But the fact is that they're really continuing to bombard all the civilian infrastructure, make it very difficult for Ukraine to constantly repair without reducing Ukraine's economic viability. For example, through discouraging people from investing and visiting. All these attacks that came very close to European. All these attacks that came very close to European buildings for the British Council, for example, in the EU, in downtown Kiev, but also at great cost to Russia, it must be said, continuing the offensive on the battlefield and, moving forward every day on taking more Ukrainian territory. Putin's intent is clearly to take all of the Donbass region. And also, I think at some point, to be able to push forward again in Zaporizhia and Kherson, even though he seems to be signaling they'd be willing to have some kind of negotiation there over freezing the lines. I don't believe that that's his intent.
And also Mykolaiv and Odessa too, if you look at the map that Gerasimov had behind his desk when he was giving that briefing recently. General Gerasimov.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that is, Kate, a signal that they've been making all along that, don't you think that we're really finished? At some point, we will go, after other targets as well, if they see Ukraine in a weak spot. Because, one other thing that they've got playing, to their advantage is the fact that Trump doesn't have any confidence in Zelensky, as we all know. And both the United States and Russia have talked about elections for a new president in Ukraine as being part of a peace process. Well, that's actually also a political disaster for Ukraine, because it means that Russia can manipulate this. And we've had the United States trying to tip the balance towards other candidates as well. So both might interfere in an election process in Ukraine.
So given where we are and what you understand of the situation, if you were advising Donald Trump today, he's in a real bind, isn't he? What would you say he should do? What would you be saying to him?
Well, I would be asking him to be in solidarity with the Europeans on this, but that is not something that he wants to do. He's still interested in tariffs against Europe. He's still putting pressure on European allies, for a variety of different issues. But what the United States needs to do is to blunt Russia's ability to take more territory on the ground and to help Ukraine defend itself against this bombardment. Because if Putin thinks he can't go any further, then that might be, a reason for him to actually have some kind of serious negotiation. It doesn't mean cutting off ties, with Russia in the sense of trying to keep outreach going there. But he also needs to have a really serious effort and serious process behind having these negotiations. With information coming in from people, not just from this intervention from European leaders all the time, about what the Russians really want, and trying to basically address this to again make it less likely that Putin is going to get everything that he desires on the ground and in the political exchange with Trump. And also, Trump needs to, I think, give Europe space to push on its own diplomacy. And that includes Europeans talking in particular to China and also to India and others and saying, what are you doing here? This is against our security. Is that what you intend? Because that would really then change the nature of interactions between European countries and China and India over the war in Ukraine. This is not just about the United States. And in fact, it might be better for everyone for the United States to be, moving back apart from in the material support for the efforts to defend Ukraine.
As we speak today, members of the so-called Coalition of the Willing are meeting in Paris, in person or virtually, and Zelensky is in Paris. We don't, at the time of us talking now, we don't know the outcomes of those meetings. But beforehand, the perception was that they want to rebrand themselves now as a kind of coalition of the ready, and their job is to convince Donald Trump that they are ready and that Europe will play a big part if and when there is a ceasefire in Ukraine. In reality, though, don't they have to be ready with or without the US backing?
Absolutely, they do. And they also have to be ready, with or without a ceasefire, to be able to work with Ukraine to basically make this defense more robust. So, look, we're very far from a ceasefire or an armistice or stopping the killing, as Trump keeps mentioning here. But we have to make sure that Ukraine, whose boots are on the ground, it's their territory that they're trying to hold, is able to hold that territory. And those are things that we really need to be addressing right now and figuring out how you keep Ukraine in the game so that Ukraine does not capitulate. We're not talking about Ukraine trying to retake all of its territory. We're trying to get Ukraine to defend the territory that it still holds. And the Europeans are the best place to do that. And then they also have to be able to show that they can deter Russian action against their own territory, against critical national infrastructure. This GPS blocking that we're getting reports of all the time, frankly, not just in the recent incident over Bulgaria with Ursula von der Leyen, the efforts to disrupt and destroy and damage undersea cables, for example, all of the sabotage and other operations, influence operations, and cyber attacks that the Russians are always conducting, and frankly, Chinese and North Koreans do too. And we've just got information now about massive cyber attack against the United States and exfiltration of data that's been going on for over a year by China. We can be pretty sure that's happening in the European context as well. Europe needs to be shoring up its defences. That was the purpose of the UK Strategic Defence Review. The French have just done a Strategic Defence Review. The Finns and the Swedes, the Norwegians and the Danes are doing this all the time. Europe just needs to get serious about its own defence and about coalitions of European countries working together. The UK already does this with the Joint Expeditionary Force, with the Nordic and Baltic countries. Europe just needs to get very serious and take the hard decisions, because the United States is not going to be there for Europe in the way that it was in the past.
And you have said before that you believe World War III is already upon us, manifesting itself in these attacks on critical national infrastructure, acts of sabotage, poisonings, assassinations. Do you think this is going to escalate into a major act of aggression, or remain at this constant level low enough to not provoke a significant retaliation?
Well, look, we have a massive act of aggression in Ukraine. And that is, I mean, the Russians see that. The Russians see how destabilizing, this is for Europe. I mean, this has got everyone on edge, and not just on edge, it's had enormous costs. I mean, at one point, there was some calculation in the UK that it cost the UK 60 billion one way or another. If you think about rising costs of inflation, extra costs for energy, extra costs for having to deal with, critical national infrastructure questions since the war in Ukraine. And I'm sure that there are very different calculations. This is just one figure that I saw some time ago. So if you think about that impact that this has had, the impact it has had on Germany, the impact that it's had on politics, this is a major occurrence, a major act, a major event, a major problem, a major challenge that all of Europe is facing. I mean, and is going to have knock-on effects for some time to come. It's changed the whole calculus for European security and for defensive posture of a host of European countries.
And President Putin has seized upon this situation and he's never changed his portrayal of the West as being the threat to Russia. Again, we saw him when he was in China accusing of the West of backing the revolution of dignity in 2014, which he described as a coup. And today he claims to be battling modern day Nazism. Entrenched views that I don't think, well, it doesn't seem like they're ever going to change. And when you were close to Trump and when you were advising him, you had firsthand witnessing of him believing that Ukraine should be part of Russia. Where do you think he stands in all of this and his deep held beliefs, and where does that leave Europe?
The problem for all of us, including here in the United States, is that Trump has a very similar worldview to Xi and Putin. He believes that might makes right. He believes in a world that's decided in terms of everything that happens politically, economically, and in security terms by meetings of the great powers, the great men who are in charge of those great powers. For example, he wants to sit down with Xi and Putin to resolve all of the world issues. He doesn't see that smaller countries, be the Ukraine, the United Kingdom, Canada, anywhere else, really have a right to make decisions, that they are takers, not deciders on the world stage. So this is extraordinarily problematic because Trump doesn't see issues in the same way that we're laying them out here. He doesn't believe in alliances. He sees the allies as vassal states or parasites, basically. That are dependent on the goodwill and the good auspices and the security protection of larger powers. He wants basically a world without responsibility and obligation for the United States. He sees the world order at an end, and his role now is to fight for the best possible position for the United States and best possible outcome in what's essentially a free-for-all, which is frankly what China and Russia also see. So the only way to really address this is for Europe and other like-minded countries to come together to figure things out for themselves, not in opposition to the United States, but to figure things out for themselves. That's where we're heading right now. There's opportunity here, but there's just enormous risk for European countries because individually they can't do anything in this context.
And how can Europe actually achieve that, though, if it hasn't got the US backing and if it has a US president and administration which is portraying Europe as freeloaders? How did they build those relationships that you were saying they should do when they should talk to India and talk to other powers in order to get closer to them when they've got one of their biggest allies actually not helping?
Well, I mean, the message is very clear again that Europe has to look to its own auspices. It doesn't have to have a rift or a rupture with the United States. It has to manage that relationship, very carefully, because at some point, things might shift in the United States. The transatlantic alliance still remains extraordinarily important for a whole mass of people in the United States. I don't want to say for everybody because it's very clear that there are members of the US administration who don't think very highly of Europe at all. They've made it very clear, publicly and privately, as we've all learned. Trump has a great affection for the UK, but it's very much rooted in his vision of the UK. There's the monarchy, the royal family, his own, ties there, his golf courses. Others, see it as a state visit, exactly. Others see it's a holiday destination. He's looking at you, Vice President Vance, who, inexplicably decided to go to the Cotswolds. I mean, it's a lovely place, but, I wouldn't have pegged that as his holiday destination, but he chose it. So, there's, something to work with. But beyond that, there is not a lot of affection for Europe or, as you've already said, confidence in Europe at this point. So Europe has to show that it's capable of defending itself and to deterring. And it should be able to do this, even if not every European country is going to take these steps. I mean, the Spanish, have been quite open in saying, look, we're not going to spend the amount that NATO is suggesting here. We're just not going to do that. But there is still great capacity and potential there. There's 550 million people in, continental Europe, the European Union, kind of writ large. There is a great ability to pool resources. It's not going to take place, obviously, quickly, but at the same time, there's all kinds of opportunity for public-private partnerships, for reinvigorating societal capacity. If you look at what Finland and Norway and Sweden have been able to do in the Baltic states, there are a lot of lessons there. There are a lot of models. And there's a lot of capacity inside the United Kingdom and elsewhere that can be harnessed. It's just they've got to get their act together. They should have got their act together years ago, frankly. Because the writing was on the wall in the first Trump administration, even before that, when Barack Obama talked about leading from behind, that the US interest in propping up US European security, or US taxpayers continuing to prop up European security, was no longer there and hasn't been there for some time. So this is evident about what Europe has to do.
And just finally, turn to Ukraine. You are clear in the knowledge that Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. Can European allies of the coalition of the willing convince and persuade Donald Trump to use leverage to force him into one, or stay the course until Putin has to stop?
Well, I think, again, Europe has to think about its own leverage and how that can be done in conjunction with the United States. If, again, you can continue to get the United States to sell weapons, defensive weapons, in particular for Ukraine, to stop this barrage of missiles, if you can work with the US defense industrial manufacturing sector also to continue to innovate and to work with European counterparts and Ukrainian counterparts to develop new, again, missile systems and defensive missile capacity for Ukraine. If you can continue to get support from the United States in terms of intelligence and data and information, European countries can also do a lot to support Ukraine. And that's really where we are right now. So it's managing that relationship with Donald Trump in particular, because, look, this is a very hyper-personalized presidency that we have here. Trump is the decisive factor. He's also the obstacle to so many things. So they really have to work on that. We have to, give our European leaders and others, and here in the United States, some leeway, to manage what is a very difficult situation. The state visit, frankly, is less of a state visit and is really a visit to manage that relationship with Donald Trump, and should be seen as such in the United Kingdom. And unfortunately, it's vital for that relationship between the UK and the United States. If it goes badly, Trump will rail against the United Kingdom. And for the UK's sake, and also for Ukraine's sake and European security's sake, that is not, kind of a good outcome. So we're going to have a lot of hard choices here. Some are unpalatable. Some are choices that people would prefer they don't make. But I'm afraid that's the situation that we're in at the moment.
Dr. Fiona Hill, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news, or read it on thetimes.com.